So this is a tough video for me to make. Originally, my video idea was going to be talking about how mindfulness interventions can help improve ulcerative colitis symptoms and Crohn's disease and stuff like that. So in the past, I had told people that my experience with mindfulness-based interventions was pretty positive. You know, I practice a lot of breath work, and I do notice that when I stay on top of my breath work, I experience a relief in a lot of ulcerative colitis symptoms. But instead of making a video on my anecdote, I wanted to make a video that's evidence-based because that's what my standard is here. And so I wanted to go on a deep dive and see, okay, well, what does the evidence actually say about mindfulness-based interventions in relationship to ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease? And I was woefully disappointed. Not only did I find that the evidence was sorely lacking in favor of mindfulness-based interventions, but I also found a lot of misrepresentation in some of these studies. There's two different studies that I'm going to talk about here today, where what they say in their descriptive statement and what their statistics actually say are completely opposite from each other. Where study number one, we're talking about Gonzalez-Moret et al. From 2020, where they talked about their CRP decreasing, which is C-reactive protein. That's a major inflammatory marker that gets measured anytime someone has colitis and they go in to get tested. And so their baseline CRP was 1.93. After a 6-month follow-up, it was 2.43. There was an increase, actually. Now, either CRP has redefined the laws of physiology or something isn't adding up here. So we're going to be breaking down some of these studies on the mindfulness and inflammatory bowel disease and all that stuff. But this is really important because one of these studies actually got included in a meta-analysis. So if you're not familiar with what a meta-analysis is, it is a study of studies. So it'll take a bunch of randomized controlled trials, it'll plug them in, there will be inclusion and exclusion criteria. Some studies will be excluded for various reasons, maybe age or gender or something like that. And then they will use statistical analysis to combine all the stats of all the studies and give you a breakdown of what's going on there. So meta-analysis can be great, but this is exactly why I'm constantly preaching that you have to go into the meta-analysis and you have to look at the individual studies. And I know it takes up a lot of time, but if you're not willing to do that, then you shouldn't have an opinion on anything. And I mean that. Like, I was just talking about how I'm guilty of kind of relying on people that I've trusted over the years. And it's gotten me in some trouble. You know, I've had people have some opinions on things, and I just kind of went with them because over the years I'd learned to trust them, and I stopped fact checking them, which is important. So if you're going to have an opinion on something, look at the individual randomized controlled trials and try to form your opinion that way, because you might come across what I came across, which is, I don't want to call it a lie, but it's a misrepresentation at the very least. And look, I'm not here to bash mindfulness because I do love mindfulness, not just for improving my colitis symptoms, but also improving quality of life in many individuals with all kinds of different circumstances. And that's not to say with ulcerative colitis, you know, one of the biggest things that happens when ulcerative colitis can be really debilitating. So it can come with depression, it can come with anxiety. And so mindfulness interventions can be useful for helping people in that way, where if someone has severe depression, because, you know, UC sometimes can stop people from being able to work, it can be really bad. And so if people fall in a really deep depression, using mindfulness-based interventions to aid on that side of it can be really helpful. So I am a big fan, but I am here to call out bad science. So let's get into the study breakdown. So study number one, the title is The Effect of a Mindfulness-Based Therapy on Different Biomarkers Among Patients with Inflammatory Bowel Disease, a randomized controlled trial. There were 57 inflammatory bowel disease patients, Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and a randomized controlled trial of a 2-to-1 ratio, 37 mindfulness group, 20 participants in the standard medical therapy group. I don't know why they did that. But anyways, the intervention was 4 internet-based therapy modules and 4 face-to-face support sessions. And those sessions could be teaching people how to do breath work, how to do things like a body scan. There might be some light movement or something in there, kind of similar to yoga. And the primary outcomes that they measured were fecal calprotectin. The secondary outcomes they measured were C-reactive protein and cortisol levels via the hair. So what the study claimed was mindfulness significantly reduced CRP levels. So what the data actually says is baseline CRP was 1.93 with a variability of 2.47. So that's kind of like the room for error that it could have. After a 6-month follow-up, it went up to 2.43 with a variability of 3.05. That is an increase. So what they said is it significantly reduced CRP levels, and that's not what their own data that is on their study says. But in all reality, what happened here is they compared CRP between groups rather than acknowledging that it increased within the mindfulness group. I don't know why they would do that, but again, giving them the benefit of the doubt. So let's talk about study number 2. This study is entitled Mindfulness Intervention Decreases Frequency and Severity of Flares in Inactive Ulcerative Colitis Patients, a randomized controlled trial. 60 participants with inactive ulcerative colitis, randomized controlled trial with a mindfulness-based stress reduction group of 30 participants, and then a control group of 30 participants. The intervention was 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction programs and weekly 2.5-hour group sessions with daily mindfulness practice. And that could include anything like guidance on breath work, body scans. There might be some like light coaching on some movements like yoga, like really mindful based movements, things of that nature. The primary outcome that they measured was flare-up frequency and severity, with secondary outcomes measuring CRP, which is again C-reactive protein, and serum pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin 6 and 8. So what the study actually claims is CRP levels were normal throughout the study period with no significant differences between groups. None of the participants had elevated CRP at the start of the study. The study concludes that mindfulness helped reduce inflammation and manage UC flares. What the data actually shows, this is from table 5 of that study if you're looking for it, and the paragraph is right around there as well. But you have the control group at baseline with 0.45, which is slightly elevated, which that's not what they said. It actually goes down and then it goes back up to 0.70 with a variability of 0.48. Now, if we look at the mindfulness group, it says 0.21 with a variability of 0.21, goes up to 0.26, up to 0.27, and then up to 0.40, which is elevated. Now, what they might have been talking about was in between group differences, but they need to look at within group differences. So just looking at the mindfulness group, that is a way more important metric to understand what was it at baseline, what happened to it, what was the trend. The problems with this study are that CRP increased in the mindfulness group. The mindfulness group started at 0.21 and increased to 0.40 by 12 months. And then the study claimed that CRP remained normal and unchanged, which is false. The control group had a major increase, started at 0.45 and ended up at 0.70 by month 12. This is an increase, not stability, like they claimed. They claimed no significant differences, but that's misleading. Even if the between group difference wasn't statistically significant, that doesn't mean that there was no change. Saying normal throughout the study period is also deceptive because CRP increased in both groups. So again, this is why it's important to look at within group differences, not between group differences. Now we've seen 2 studies misrepresent their own data, but what happens when a meta-analysis includes one of those studies? Now, again, the reason why this matters is one of these studies, Gonzalez et al., was included in a meta-analysis looking at the same topic. This meta-analysis was done in 2023. It's entitled The Mindfulness-Based Interventions in Inflammatory Bowel Disease, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. It included 8 studies with 271 participants. That's not a lot of people altogether, which is even worse, which means that a study that shows a specific result could have an even bigger impact on the results of the meta-analysis. Short-term CRP measured in 4 studies, long-term CRP not measured. Now, what the meta-analysis concluded was standard mean deviation of 0.25 with a 95% confidence interval of negative 0.49 to negative 0.01. So that's a reduction. But again, what we have to take into account here is that Gonzalez, Moret et al. Was included. So 0.25 reduction already isn't that big, right? So if you take into account that one of the studies they're talking about actually showed an increase, that could actually change this result from 0.25 to potentially even an increase. I don't know. But if bad data goes into a meta-analysis, then the conclusion is compromised, period. So what is the takeaway here? I think, when you have 2 separate studies claiming that CRP was reduced and it was actually increased by their own data, please go check the studies. I'm going to leave them in the description. And then you also see that one of those studies was included in a meta-analysis looking at the same thing. This is a problem. And there are people that take meta-analysis as sort of the gold standard over individualized randomized trials. And I was just talking to physionic Dr. Nicholas Verhoeven. He was just on, I just interviewed him, and we were talking about this very topic. And I think we view it very similarly, where meta-analysis can be useful, but they have to be done really well. And you also have to take the time to look into what is the data that's being plugged into it. But how to spot this for yourself? I mean, you have to look at the raw data and also look for within group changes. So don't just read what they say, go to the group, not the control group, the intervention group, and look at it over the follow-up period, whatever the period is. If it's 8 weeks, you have to compare that starting number to what that number actually changes to across the intervention. And then also when you're looking at meta-analysis, look at the referenced studies and go look at some of them. You know, I'm not saying you have to go look at every single one, because who really has time to do that? If you don't do this as a living in some form or fashion, then you really don't need to. But again, I would implore you, if you're not willing to do that, then do not form strong opinions on things, because it's stuff like this where I feel strongly that mindfulness is good. And I did feel strongly that mindfulness was good for reducing inflammation. But maybe that was just my well-being. Who knows? I can't confidently say anymore that mindfulness-based interventions are going to improve someone's colitis, are actually improving my colitis, or that they have any sort of positive effect on inflammatory markers. So look, my final thoughts are mindfulness might actually have some real benefits, but if researchers keep twisting the data, then we'll never know the truth. And I really hope that if someone's watching this and you are familiar with these studies or you're familiar with these researchers, send them this video and see if they reach out. And maybe there's a retraction that needs to be made. Maybe there's a fix that needs to be made, because that does happen often. A study will be released, especially that meta-analysis released in 2023. That's not that long ago. So usually when studies are new, there's like a period of time where retractions are made or whatever. But either way, I think it's important for them to know. And we got to keep these lines of communications open, like I'm always talking about, and keep talking about this stuff. But subscribe if you want more breakdowns of studies like this. And if you find any suspicious studies like this, please send them my way, because I'm interested in looking at the data and stuff. But I appreciate you sticking around, watching and listening, and I will see you at the next one.